A small Roman cup in a London museum does something that seems impossible. In ordinary light, it is a murky green. Shine a light through it, and it glows a deep, translucent red. Made around the 4th century AD, its color-changing secret remained a mystery for 16 centuries. It was not until 1990 that scientists cracked the puzzle. The glass contains tiny particles of gold and silver, each less than 1,000th of a millimeter across. These nanoparticles interact with light so that the cup appears green in reflected light and red when lit from behind. In effect, the Romans had accidentally or perhaps deliberately created a form of nanotechnology, a feat not understood or replicated until the 20th century. This is not an isolated curiosity. The Lycurgus Cup is a surviving fragment of a much larger story. Across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Rome, glassmakers developed techniques that were breathtakingly sophisticated. They could produce colors that defied nature, carve glass into intricate cameo layers, and create mosaic patterns that rival any modern work. And then, for a variety of reasons, those techniques disappeared. The knowledge was lost, sometimes for centuries, sometimes forever. The workshops that once produced these wonders fell silent, their secrets lost under sand, rubble, and political collapse. How did they achieve such feats, and what else has slipped through the cracks of history? The Lycurgus Cup is not a lonely miracle. It is a clue, a gateway into a network of lost glassmaking centers that once dotted the ancient world. Each one had its own speciality, its own formula, its own fragile grip on a craft that demanded generations of trial and error. When those centers vanished, whole universes of technique vanished with them. To understand how this pattern began, we need to go back to the very start of glassmaking, to a time before the Romans, before the Greeks, before anyone thought to write down the recipe for a color-changing cup. That story begins in the dust of northern Syria, at a settlement called Brak, where the first sparks of glass were kindled more than 4,000 years ago. Brak flourished more than 5,000 years ago in what is now northeastern Syria. In the 1990s, archaeologists working there uncovered small glass beads and a vessel fragment. Radiocarbon dating placed them around 3,500 BC, more than a millennium before the earliest previously known glass objects. The pieces are crude by comparison, opaque and irregular, often a deep blue-green from copper impurities. Yet they represent the first known attempt by human hands to deliberately transform sand and ash into glass. These early artisans used core forming. They shaped a removable core of sand and mud, dipped it into molten glass or wound threads of softened glass around it, then scraped out the core after cooling. The process was time-consuming and unpredictable, and the finished pieces were no larger than a finger. The discovery proves that the basic chemistry of glassmaking was understood far earlier than the historical record suggests. Someone in that northern Mesopotamian plain learned to fuse silica with flux at temperatures near 1,000 degrees Celsius and shape the result into a usable object. But nearly all evidence of that tradition is gone. No workshop remains, no piles of furnace slag, no written recipes. For the next 500 years, the archaeological record for glass is almost blank. When glass reappears in the mid-3rd millennium BC, it emerges from different centers further south in Babylonia and later in Egypt. The knowledge at Brak was not passed down. It vanished when its practitioners could no longer carry it on. This concrete discovery reshapes the timeline. Glassmaking is not a later invention of the great empires but a craft that flickered into life in a relatively obscure settlement and then went dark. The techniques were simple, but they contained all the essential principles that later glassmakers would refine. That first spark was extinguished almost before it caught, leaving no direct lineage to the sophisticated glass of later millennia. Around the 15th century BC, glassmaking reappeared in a completely different form in the sun-bleached workshops of Egypt under Pharaoh Thutmose III. The glass that came out of Egypt was nothing like the simple, opaque beads of Tel Brak. It was vibrant, deliberately colored, and treated as a royal luxury almost on par with gold and lapis lazuli. The Egyptians did not just make vessels, they produced mosaic tiles, inlaid jewelry, and tiny vases. These shimmered with colors no one had seen before. Deep cobalt blue, brilliant turquoise, fiery red, and a green as fresh as the Nile Delta in spring. At the heart of this explosion of color stood a city that would burn bright and then vanish in a single generation. Amarna. Akhenaten built Amarna as his new capital around 1350 BC, and the archaeological record there contains some of the most spectacular glass objects from the ancient world. The workman's village, the palace remains, and the discarded crucibles all hint at a dedicated glass industry operating on a scale no previous century could match. Raw materials were often shipped from the Levant as tribute or trade goods. Egyptian artisans crushed, melted, and mixed these ingots with metal oxides to achieve their signature colors. Cobalt produced the deep blue, copper gave turquoise and green, antimony and lead created opacifiers for opaque whites and yellows, and conservators are surprised to find that these artisans already understood the use of manganese as a decolorizer. They could produce near-transparent glass long before Roman glassmakers perfected the same method. Color was more than decoration. It was identity. Egyptian glassworks from the Amarna period often carried the cartouche of the pharaoh, and the specific shades may have held ritual or symbolic meanings we can only guess at. The sheer chromatic range suggests a deep empirical knowledge of chemistry. The artisans knew which metal oxide would give what hue, how to control furnace temperature to avoid mudded results, and how to layer contrasting colors to create patterned surfaces. Then, almost overnight, it stopped. The Amarna period ended after Akhenaten's reign, and the state-sponsored glass workshops that had flourished there were dismantled. Some glassmaking continued in Egypt for centuries after, but the brilliant colors of Amarna disappeared. The specific recipes for that cobalt blue, that turquoise, that red were simply no longer produced. Later Egyptian glass tends toward more common shades, pale blue, green, or a muddy brown. The loss was not a matter of broken furnaces or forgotten skills. It was a loss of precise chemical knowledge. No written recipes survive from Amarna. The color formulas were part of an unwritten craft tradition, passed hand to hand, and when the workshops closed, that tradition was broken. The ancient world's most color-dazzling glass existed for maybe a century or less, and then faded. Why would such valuable knowledge vanish so fast when the base materials and general technique remained? The color of Amarna was not lost because the craft itself ended. It was lost because no one wrote the formulas down, no one preserved them outside the closed world of the palace workshop. What other secrets might have been extinguished alongside the art of that brilliant blue? If the Egyptian loss was about specific chemical formulas locked inside palace workshops, the Mycenaean case presents something even starker. The loss of an entire production system, from raw material supply to distribution. On the Greek mainland, at sites like Pylos, Mycenae, and Turin, archaeologists have found glass beads, relief plaques, and inlays, modest objects used for furniture or jewelry. Not the large colored vessels of Amarna, these pieces were nonetheless sophisticated. The relief plaques were pressed into molds, a form of mass production requiring careful heat and timing, and the beads often carried intricate spirals and geometric patterns. Yet the raw glass itself almost certainly came from abroad. chemical analysis suggests the Mycenaeans imported ingots from Egypt or the Near East. They did not refine their own sand or soda. This dependency meant the glass industry was highly centralized, controlled by palace bureaucracies. Linear B tablets from Pylos record quantities of raw glass allocated to artisans, a state-sponsored luxury craft, tightly managed and reliant on the palace economy. When that economy collapsed around 1100 BC during the Late Bronze Age, glassmaking stopped, not gradually but completely. For centuries after the palatial centers fell, almost no glass production appears in the archaeological record. Pottery and simpler metalwork continued, but glass vanished. It was not until the Archaic period, around the 8th century BC, that glass reappeared in Greece, and then it was a different craft. New techniques, new raw material sources, new styles. Whatever knowledge the Mycenaean artisans possessed did not survive the collapse. The skill was not written down. The supply lines were severed. The palaces that housed the workshops were burned or abandoned. A generation later, no one remained who knew how to transform Egyptian ingots into Mycenaean plaques. This raises a complication. The Mycenaean glass industry did not end because the technique was too difficult. It ended because the conditions that made it possible, stable trade routes, centralized administration, demand for luxury goods from a palace elite, were destroyed. When those conditions vanished, the craft vanished with them. The centuries without glass in Greece show that a craft can disappear so thoroughly that even basic knowledge must be reinvented. The Mycenaean loss was not a fading of color. It was a complete disappearance followed by a long gap. While Greece experienced a long glassmaking gap, the Phoenician ports of Sidon and Tyre were mastering a different innovation. Clear, nearly colorless glass from the 6th century BC onward. Roman writers later praised this transparent glass as the finest in the known world. Achieving that clarity required overcoming a technical problem. Ordinary sand contains iron oxide, which gives glass a green or yellow tint. Adding manganese turned the green to amber, but the result was still not truly clear. The Phoenicians discovered that antimony acted as a more effective decolorizer. When combined with nearly iron-free sand from the Belus River, antimony neutralized the remaining trace colors and produced glass that was genuinely transparent. This combination of a specific sand source and a precise additive was the key to their success. Consistent use of antimony and low iron across generations indicates a carefully protected recipe passed down through workshops. Demand for this clear glass grew quickly. Phoenician merchants shipped it across the Mediterranean, where it became highly sought after by Greeks and later Romans for their banquets. Sidon and Tyre grew wealthy from the production of these glass vessels that carried wine, perfume, and oils to elite tables. This industry did not last. The Persian Empire's conquest of Phoenician cities in the late 6th century BC disrupted the stable conditions that had allowed the glassmakers to thrive. The loss of local autonomy and redirection of trade weakened the ports. Then in 332 BC, Alexander the Great besieged and destroyed Tyre. The city was razed and its population dispersed. Sidon surrendered and fared better, but the region's economic core was broken. The workshops that had passed down the antimony decolorization technique for generations never recovered. Over the following centuries, the secret of producing truly clear glass became rare, and eventually the ability to produce genuinely colorless glass was gone. The loss of Phoenician clear glass rippled through the Mediterranean, but a new center was already rising. When Alexander the Great founded Alexandria in 331 BC, he created a city that would become the intellectual and artistic heart of the Hellenistic world. By the 3rd century BC, its glass workshops were producing something no one had seen before: Mosaic glass, what we often call millefiori. The technique worked like this. Artisans took canes of glass in different colors, bundled them together while hot, and fused them into a single rod. When sliced crosswise, each disc revealed a repeating pattern of flowers, stars, or geometric motifs. These slices were then arranged side by side in a mold and heated until they flowed together into a single vessel or plaque. The result was a surface that looked like intricate inlaid gemstone, but it was solid glass throughout. Alexandria's glassmakers mastered this process to an extraordinary degree, creating bowls and plates with hundreds of tiny, perfectly aligned pattern units. The sheer precision required is staggering. Each cane had to be drawn to the exact same diameter, each slice cut to identical thickness. Any variation would disrupt the pattern, and because the pieces fused together in the kiln, there was no second chance. But Alexandria's most celebrated innovation was Cameo glass. This technique involved building up at least 2 layers of contrasting colors, typically a dark base and a white overlay, and then carving away the outer layer to produce a raised design. The effect was like a gemstone cameo, but made from layers of glass that had to be perfectly compatible in their thermal expansion. If the layers cooled at different rates, the entire piece would shatter. Fewer than 20 complete cameo glass vessels survive from antiquity, and the technique appears to have been extremely difficult to execute. Pliny the Elder mentions that such glass was considered more valuable than gold. The origins of cameo glass are still debated, but most evidence points to Alexandria in the 2nd or 1st century BC. A few fragments found there show the signature layered carving. When Rome annexed Egypt in 30 BC, the Ptolemaic court workshops were absorbed into the imperial system. Some Alexandrian craftsmen relocated to Rome, taking their tools and recipes with them. But the knowledge of polychrome layering did not transplant easily. The precise recipes for the base and overlay glasses, the firing schedules, and the carving techniques were closely guarded. In the upheaval of the Roman takeover, many workshop traditions scattered and were lost. The Roman cameo glass that followed, the famous Portland Vase being the finest example, was created by a small group of artisans who preserved a fragment of the original Alexandrian technique. But even they could not maintain the full range. After the 1st century AD, cameo glass production ceased almost entirely. The Portland Vase remained an isolated masterpiece, a lonely survivor of a technique that had already passed out of living memory. Alexandria had shown what was possible. Now the question was whether Rome could hold onto it. Across the Aegean, on Rhodes and Delos, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of thriving glass workshops from the 3rd to 1st centuries BC. These were not royal factories but commercial operations producing luxury wares for Hellenistic trade routes. They turned out colorful millefiori rods, bundles of glass canes fused and sliced into floral patterns, and distinctive ribbed bowls pressed into molds and finished by hand. The millefiori technique involved bundling thin rods of different colors, heating them until fused, and drawing them into a long cane. Sliced crosswise, each disc revealed a repeating pattern. These slices were arranged inside a mold and fused to form bowls, plates, or inlays. The ribbed bowls, with their radial ridges, required precise control of the glass temperature during pressing and careful finishing of the rim. Both types demanded skill that took years to develop. The island's success depended on geography. Both sat at the crossroads of major sea routes linking the Aegean, the Levant, and the Western Mediterranean. Raw glass arrived from Egypt and the Levant, often as large ingots that were melted and worked in the island's kilns. Finished wares were packed in ceramic amphorae and shipped alongside wine, olive oil, and textiles. Graffiti and commercial marks found in the workshops suggest a highly organized industry with multiple kilns and specialized workers. Some focused on melting raw glass, others on shaping, and still others on finishing. The distribution of these vessels across the Mediterranean, from Spain to the Black Sea, testifies to the reach of Hellenistic commerce. Craftsmen also experimented with their own recipes, achieving subtle variations in color and transparency that set their wares apart. Then the Roman conquest shifted economic power westward. Delos, once a free port and major trading hub, was sacked in 69 BC and never fully recovered. Rhodes retained some independence as a Roman ally, but its glass industry could not compete with the scale emerging in Italy. Workshops on both islands dwindled. Some techniques, like ridged bowls, were absorbed into Roman glassmaking, becoming simpler and more standardized, mass-produced rather than artisanal. But the elaborate millefiori patterns and specific color combinations, those deep blues and translucent greens, faded. The precise recipes were not recorded. They existed only in the memories of a few artisans, and when the workshops closed, those secrets were not passed on. The shift from the Mediterranean islands to the Italian mainland was swift. When the Romans absorbed the Hellenistic world, they inherited an appetite for glass and the means to satisfy it on a scale no previous civilization had managed. The true transformation came from a single innovation perfected around the 1st century BC, almost certainly in Syria: glass blowing. Before it, glass was laboriously core-formed or pressed into molds. With a hollow iron pipe, an artisan could inflate molten glass into a bubble, shape it with tools, and produce a vessel in minutes. The technique allowed thinner walls, larger forms, and far greater variety. It spread within decades. Workshops appeared across Italy, Gaul, and the provinces, producing bottles, cups, windows, and decorative pieces by the thousands. Glass became everyday. It held wine, oil, and ointments. It let in light through window panes. It served as cheap jewelry for the common soldier's wife. Yet the empire also supported extraordinary decorative work. Along with the famous Lycurgus Cup, Roman glassmakers created cage cups, intricate vessels carved from a single thick layer of glass with an open-work net around the inner shell. They made gold glass with thin sheets of gold leaf sandwiched between layers and inscribed with portraits and inscriptions. They mastered millefiori and Mosaic glass on a grand scale, fusing hundreds of multicolored rods into mesmerizing patterns. They also produced the first high-quality colorless glass on a large scale, using antimony and manganese to strip unwanted tints, creating vessels so clear they were prized as almost crystal. The economic infrastructure was immense. Raw glass, often produced in the Levant and Egypt, was shipped in blocks to secondary workshops. Major factories operated in Campania, the Rhineland, and Gaul. Shipwrecks yield massive quantities of glass fragments, indicating highly organized trade. Rome itself had quarters where glassmakers clustered, and their work reached every corner of the empire. But the 3rd century crisis of civil war, invasion, economic collapse, and plague changed everything. High-end decorative glass suffered disproportionately. Demand for luxury items dried up. Workshops that produced cage cups and gold glass vanished. The knowledge to create a diatreta or fuse gold leaf was not written down. It existed only in the hands of a few artisan families. Without patronage or stable trade routes, those skills disappeared. Glassblowing itself survived and continued into Byzantine and Islamic worlds. Ordinary vessels were still made, but the peak of Roman decorative glass faded. Some techniques resurfaced later, often independently and with a different character. Others were not truly replicated until modern times, after decades of painstaking research. Rome had raised glassmaking to an empire-wide height, but that height was fragile. The loss was a slow erosion of skill compounded by economic hardship and political collapse. When it was gone, no one alive could explain how it had been done. The empire left behind mountains of broken glass, but the secrets of its most breathtaking works slipped into a silence lasting 15 centuries. One of the most telling survivors from that silence is the Portland Vase. Created in the 1st century AD, likely in a Roman workshop drawing on Hellenistic traditions from Alexandria, the vase is made from 2 layers of glass. A deep blue-black core encased in opaque white. A carver, using a rotating wheel and abrasive powders, cut away the white layer to reveal the dark beneath, creating figures in high relief. The mythological scenes, probably Peleus and Thetis, are executed with extraordinary subtlety. The white figures seem to emerge from the darkness with the softness of marble. But this is glass, brittle and unforgiving, easy to crack with a single misjudged cut. Only a handful of Cameo glass vessels survive from antiquity, fewer than 20 in total. Most are fragments. The Portland Vase is the finest intact example, though even it has been broken. In 1845, a visitor accidentally broke it into many pieces, and it was painstakingly reassembled using a complex internal framework. Its cracks are barely visible today, but its history of damage underscores not just physical fragility, but also its role as a transmitter of lost knowledge. For centuries, the vase baffled glassmakers. How could anyone carve such thin layers without shattering the whole piece? The white layer had to be perfectly uniform, applied in a precise thickness. The glass had to anneal slowly to relieve internal stresses. The carving demanded a steady hand and a deep understanding of how glass responds to pressure. Modern attempts to replicate the Portland vase have been instructive but incomplete. Master glass artisans have produced Cameo vessels, but the combination of flawless layering, depth of relief, and sharpness of detail in the original remains elusive. In the 1990s, a team at the Corning Museum of Glass spent years experimenting with layered glass, only to find that the exact recipe, its composition, cooling schedule, and specific abrasives had not been preserved. They produced beautiful pieces, but none matched the Portland vase's quality. The practical consequence is stark. This vase is not just a museum masterpiece. It is a rare survivor from a category of glassmaking that disappeared almost entirely. The skill to carve Cameo glass at this level was concentrated in a handful of workshops, passed down through apprenticeship, never written down. When those workshops closed and patronage dried up, the live knowledge vanished with the artisans. The vase remains beautiful and admired but silent. It cannot teach us exactly how it was made. If the Portland vase guards its secret stubbornly, another Roman glass object has gradually given up its own, only to reveal an even more unsettling truth. The Lycurgus Cup, its green to red color shift, a trick of light you've likely seen in photographs, but the science behind it is something else entirely. When the cup was examined under an electron microscope in the 1990s, researchers found something they did not expect. Scattered throughout the glass were tiny particles of gold and silver, each about 50 nanometers across. A nanometer is a billionth of a meter. These nanoparticles interact with light in a way that macroscopic gold and silver cannot. When light hits the cup from the front, the particles scatter shorter wavelengths more strongly, giving the glass a green appearance. But when light passes through from the back, the longer wavelengths, the red end of the spectrum, dominate. It is the same phenomenon that creates the red color in stained glass windows that use colloidal gold, but with a complexity that remained unexplained until modern physics. So the cup is a 400s AD object that uses nanotechnology, a field we only began to understand in the 20th century. The question that immediately follows is whether the Roman glassmaker knew what they were doing. Was this a deliberate creation or an accident? The evidence points toward intention. The concentration of gold and silver, roughly 40 parts per million of gold and 300 parts per million of silver, is not a random trace. And the distribution of nanoparticles is consistent, not the scattered clumps you would get from contamination. The glass also contains antimony, which was used to stabilize the nanoparticles. That suggests a controlled process. Perhaps a recipe involved adding ground gold and silver to the melt in specific proportions. Then the glass was cooled in a particular way to form the nanoparticles. But no written records of such a recipe survive. The cup is the only known example of this effect from the ancient world. This singularity raises questions about how widespread such knowledge was. If it was a deliberate technique, why did it not appear in other Roman glass objects? One possibility is that it was the work of a single workshop, perhaps in Rome or Alexandria, that specialized in luxury glass for the elite. The cup's mythological scene of King Lycurgus, who attacked the god Dionysus and was punished with madness, fits the taste of the Roman aristocracy for Greek mythology. But the technique required metals that were expensive and difficult to work with. Gold and silver, especially in powdered form, were not cheap materials to risk in a molten batch of glass. The yield would have been low and the result unpredictable. It might have been a rare experimental product, one that failed to catch on because the cost was too high or the results too inconsistent. Modern attempts to replicate the Lycurgus cup have produced dichroic glass, but never with the same precision. Scientists at the University of Oxford and elsewhere have used chemical processes to create nanoparticles in glass, but they have had to use a controlled atmosphere furnace and precise timing. The Roman artisan had a wood-fired furnace open to the air with no thermocouple. The fact that they achieved such uniformity is a testament to their skill, but also a reminder of how much tacit knowledge was never written down. The cup itself is a kind of frozen accident or a frozen intention that left no instructional trace. When the workshop that produced it disappeared, so did the ability to make anything like it again. The Lycurgus cup stands at the peak of Roman optical glass. It is not just a decorative vessel, it is a material feat that we still struggle to match using the same technologies. And the more we learn about it, the more we understand. What was lost is not merely a recipe but a way of thinking. It is a set of hands-on trials and errors that cannot be recovered from a written formula. The cup's secret has been revealed, but that revelation only deepens the ache of its loss. We know how it works, we still do not know how it was made. And likely we never will. The Lycurgus cup is not the only Roman glass that defies explanation. A different kind of vessel challenges not chemistry but structure and nerve. The cage cup or diatretum. A cage cup is an inner drinking vessel surrounded by an open-work cage, all carved from a single thick blank. The cage emerges from the same piece of glass, connected only by thin struts sometimes as narrow as a matchstick. Letters and figures stand free of the surface. Any slip of the tool cracks the glass and ruins the piece. Yet Roman craftsmen carved elaborate inscriptions in the round, leaving letters suspended in space. Fewer than 24 cage cups survive. One of the finest, found in Cologne and nearly intact, bears a drinking toast. Another from Pula in Croatia shows geometric patterns on its base and the name of its intended owner. The artisan cut a thick cylinder with a wheel and abrasive powder, gradually reducing the background until only the letters and cage remained. The margin for error was fractions of a millimeter. This technique disappears in the 4th century. No cage cups are known from later periods. The skill was lost because the entire ecosystem of patronage and workshop training collapsed. The Roman economy contracted, the luxury market shrank, and the workshops that passed down these secrets for generations closed. Modern attempts to replicate cage cups have succeeded, but they reveal the tremendous demand of the process. Glass cutters using diamond wheels and constant water cooling describe the work as a nightmare of concentration. One replica took months of daily labor, and the result, though beautiful, lacks the precision of the originals. We now know the method, wheel cutting with a fine abrasive, likely emery or sand, but knowing the method does not bring back the skill. When the last craftsman who held that feel laid down his wheel, the knowledge went with him. While the workshops of Rome were shutting down, another tradition was reaching its peak in the east. The Sasanian Empire, which ruled Persia from the 3rd to the 7th centuries, produced some of the finest cut glass the ancient world ever saw. Their masterpieces are not as famous as the Lycurgus Cup or the Portland Vase, but they belong in the same conversation about lost skill. Sasanian glass is known for its deep, precise wheel-cut patterns, dense rows of facets, geometric stars, and repeated circles, often carved into thick-walled bowls and bottles. The effect is almost sculptural. The glass itself is frequently a pale green or a faint aqua, intentionally decolorized with manganese to achieve a clarity that rivals modern soda-lime glass. These pieces were not just local luxuries. They have been found from Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf all the way to Japan and Korea, carried along the Silk Road. That tells us the Sasanian workshops were producing at a scale and quality that could compete with anything Rome had to offer. The technique they used was fundamentally the same wheel cutting that would later be applied to the cage cups. But the Sasanian style was distinct. The cuts are deeper, the designs more repetitive and symmetrical, almost like a mechanical print on glass. It required extraordinary control. One wrong angle and the whole vessel could fracture, and unlike the Romans, who eventually switched to mold-blown glass for mass production, the Sasanians kept refining this cutting tradition for centuries. Then something changed. After the Arab conquest of the 7th century, Sasanian glassmaking did not simply vanish. Early Islamic glassmakers inherited many of the same techniques. They continued to produce facet-cut bowls and bottles, but over time, the deepest, most intricate cutting began to disappear. The finest Sasanian work had relied on a specific combination of raw materials, a particular type of manganese-rich sand, and a workshop environment that was closely tied to the royal court and Zoroastrian temples. When those institutions were dismantled, the supply chain for the best glass and the training for the most demanding cutting techniques gradually fragmented. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Islamic glassblowers had shifted their focus to new inventions: luster painting, enamel decoration, and the delicate arabesque patterns that would define the medieval Islamic world. The old Sasanian wheel cutting was not exactly lost, it was left behind. That is a new complication in our understanding of loss. It is not always a sudden collapse. Sometimes a technique simply becomes irrelevant, its practitioners die off, and the skill is no longer valued enough to pass on. The Sasanian cut glass survived in museum collections and a few isolated pieces, but the muscle memory that created it faded within a few generations, even as glassmaking itself continued to flourish. The loss was not of an entire industry. It was of a specific, demanding art form that depended on a vanished ecosystem of patronage, material access, and cultural taste. The same pattern of quiet loss played out in the early Islamic period, but on a much larger scale. When the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates rose, they inherited the glassmaking traditions of Rome and Persia. New workshops flourished in Syria, Iraq, and Iran, using the same high-quality sands and raw glass recipes that had served earlier empires. Islamic glassmakers fused Roman-blown vessels with Sasanian cutting techniques and created innovations of their own. They developed luster painting, firing metallic compounds onto the surface in a complex multi-step process that required precise control of temperature and atmosphere to produce a shimmering finish. They mastered gilding and enamel decoration, layering gold leaf and colored enamels onto mosque lamps, drinking vessels, and window glass. In the 9th and 10th centuries, centers like Raqqa and Basra exported these luxury goods along the Silk Road to China and Scandinavia, and their techniques were admired across continents. But this success rested on extreme specialization. Each major center focused on its own techniques, color palettes, and recipes. A workshop in Nishapur might excel in deep cobalt blue derived from local minerals, while one in Tyre specialized in clear glass with gold leaf inlays. The intricate knowledge of raw material sources, kiln temperatures, firing schedules, and timing was held by a few master craftsmen and was not written down. It existed only in practice and was passed through apprenticeship within a single workshop or family. That regional focus meant that when a particular center was disrupted, its knowledge could disappear because no one else practiced that exact method. The entire ecosystem depended on stable patronage, access to rare minerals, and thriving trade routes. The disruption came through major upheavals. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century devastated the great glassmaking cities of Iraq and Iran. Baghdad was sacked in 1258, its libraries burned and its artisans scattered or killed. Raqqa was abandoned. The Silk Road became dangerous and eventually declined, cutting off access to raw materials and markets. Specialized knowledge of certain color recipes, especially those requiring rare minerals from specific quarries, was lost as the skilled craftsmen died without passing on their secrets. The older Sasanian cutting techniques, already marginalized by the popularity of enamel and luster styles, were overshadowed entirely. When those later styles fell out of fashion in the later medieval period, their methods faded as well. There were no workshops left to preserve them. Luster painting, precise formulas for vibrant reds and blues, the intricate wheel cutting inherited from Sasanian times, these were no longer taught. By the 15th century, much of the high-end artistic glass of the early Islamic world was gone. The pattern appears repeatedly across millennia. Every major glassmaking center shared a structural fragility. First, concentration. Amarna's workshops depended entirely on Akhenaten's patronage. When the city was abandoned, its entire glass industry stopped. Mycenaean glassmaking was tied to palace economies. Those palaces collapsed around 1100 BCE, and with them went the knowledge of importing, coloring, and shaping raw glass. The specialists belonged to a closed system, and when the system vanished, they had nowhere else to go. The Phoenician centers of Sidon and Tyre relied on a specific antimony recipe and a deep understanding of local sand, secrets held by a few families or guilds. The Persian conquest disrupted trade, and Alexander's siege devastated Tyre. The specialists scattered or perished, and the recipe for that remarkable purity faded. No one outside that small circle had recorded it. That leads to the second factor, secrecy. Ancient glassmaking was rarely written down. The few surviving texts, like parts of Pliny the Elder, offer fragments. The real knowledge, exact temperatures, precise mineral combinations, timing of annealing, was passed from master to apprentice through demonstration. If the apprentice was lost or the workshop shut down, the knowledge vanished with the master. The Lycurgus Cup is a striking example. The artisan who made it understood metal nanoparticles, whether through experimentation, coincidence, or an intuitive grasp of chemistry. That understanding was carried into silence. The third factor is dependence on rare raw materials. The deep cobalt blue of Egyptian and later Islamic glass came from mines in the Iranian plateau or the Sinai. Manganese for decoloring had to be imported from specific regions. The sand itself needed the right silica content with low iron impurities. When trade routes shifted, a mine was exhausted, or war-cut supply chains, entire color palettes disappeared. The vivid turquoise of the Amarna period looked modern, but after the city was abandoned, the source of that copper or cobalt compound was forgotten. Later glassmakers could not replicate it because the raw material no longer reached them. Consider the contrast with Chinese porcelain. Porcelain also relied on specific clays and imperial kilns, but the Chinese state maintained permanent institutions that kept records and trained successors for centuries. Glassmaking in the Mediterranean and Near East never had that institutional continuity. It was purely artisanal, rooted in place and person. When the person or the place was lost, the knowledge evaporated. The issue is not a single catastrophe but a recurring weakness. The same forces that allowed these centers to produce extraordinary works, specialization, secrecy, dependence on volatile trade and patronage, became liabilities in times of instability. Because the knowledge was never recorded in a stable, transferable form, each loss was permanent. What we see is not steady progress but a series of peaks and valleys. After every center vanished, later generations could only wonder at what had been made. They could not pick up where the old masters left off. They had to start over, often with cruder techniques, because the bridge of knowledge had been burned. That burned bridge seemed impassable for over 1,000 years. Yet in recent decades, scientists and artisans have begun rebuilding it, using modern analysis and skilled hands. Some techniques remain out of reach, but others are yielding their secrets. The Corning Museum of Glass in upstate New York has led this effort. Its researchers and glassblowers study ancient fragments, run chemical analyses, and attempt recreations. Using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, they detect trace elements down to parts per billion, reading exact recipes, including sand, flux, colorants, and firing temperature. This analysis has shown that many ancient glasses were more carefully composed than expected. The Lycurgus Cup's color-changing effect was explained in the 1990s when electron microscopy revealed gold and silver nanoparticles about 50 nanometers across. That explained the dichroism but raised a deeper question. Was the Roman artisan skilled or lucky? Modern replicas suggest a careful procedure. Scientists at the University of Arizona and elsewhere ground gold and silver into dust and added it in controlled amounts to molten glass, producing a similar effect. But the process is extremely sensitive. Tiny variations in temperature, cooling rate, or metal concentration change the result. The ancient maker likely followed a precise recipe. That recipe was lost, and even with modern knowledge, perfectly duplicating the cup has proven almost impossible. The closest replicas still look subtly different. Cage cups or diatreta were long considered a lost art. In the 1980s, German engraver Erwin Hollersee studied where marks on original fragments and realized ancient craftsmen used wheel cutting and hand abrasion from the outside in. He spent years developing the technique and eventually created a replica from a single glass block, taking over 200 hours of carving. The result was indistinguishable from a genuine 4th century cup. Hollersee proved the technique was not mysterious, just extraordinarily time-consuming. That was precisely why it disappeared. No commercial workshop could justify the expense when a simpler casting method could produce a vessel in hours. Cameo glass has been partially revived. The Portland Vase has been studied extensively, and modern glassblowers layer colors and carve with rotary tools. But the original hand carving achieved precision and depth that remain difficult to match. The Corning Museum's Cameo workshop produces high-quality pieces, but artisans admit ancient examples have a subtlety modern copies lack, as if from generations of practice. These modern efforts reveal a pattern. The vanished techniques were not impossible but demanding. They required specific raw materials, stable supply chains, specialized workshops, and artisans trained from childhood. When those conditions collapsed, the skills could not survive. Now, by reverse engineering, we recover not just objects but knowledge. We know the cobalt blue of Amarna glass came from a specific Egyptian desert source, and the manganese used to clear glass in Phoenicia was imported from Anatolia. We have identified the beach sands Roman glassmakers preferred and mapped trade networks across the Mediterranean. One concrete discovery stands out. In 2009, a Corning Museum team built a fully functional replica of a Roman glass furnace using only 1st century materials and techniques. They mined local sand, built the furnace from clay, and fired it with wood. The glass produced was comparable in quality to Roman commercial glass. The experiment proved that raw ingredients were not the limiting factor. The loss was not about missing resources, but missing people. Without the craftsmen, the furnace was just a pile of clay. That experiment reveals the core truth. The clay furnace, the local sand, the wood fire, all of it remained available. What vanished after political collapses and economic shifts were the people who knew how to combine them into something extraordinary. The furnace is just clay. The knowledge never resided in the raw materials. It lived in hands trained for decades, passed down in whispers from master to apprentice, never written down because it did not need to be until the chain broke. This is the real lesson from the lost glassmaking centers of the ancient world. Not that ancient people were mysteriously brilliant or that we have regressed, but that specialized knowledge, when concentrated in a few hands and unsupported by broader culture, can vanish entirely. The Lycurgus Cup is not a fluke. It is a monument to a system that produced people who could do things we still struggle to replicate. Yet that system was fragile. The palace economies of Mycenae, the guilds of Sidon, the workshops of Amarna all depended on stability, trade routes, and patronage. When those conditions shifted, the knowledge did not relocate. It ended with its last practitioner. That fragility is not ancient history. Consider the skills in your own world kept alive by a shrinking number of people. The person who restores a medieval stained glass window, the technician who maintains a century-old machine, even the engineer who understands a programming language written 40 years ago. When those people retire or leave, their knowledge can disappear just as completely as the recipe for Egyptian cobalt blue. We live in an age that celebrates innovation, but we are not immune to loss. The glassmakers left behind only the objects. The Portland Vase, the cage cups, the Lycurgus Cup survived not because they were understood, but because they were beautiful and durable. Each one is a question mark. We are still excavating their secrets, slowly rebuilding what was lost. Every time a modern artisan manages to replicate an ancient technique, it is a small act of recovery, not just of a skill, but of a person's life's work reaching across centuries. Which brings us to a question worth considering. If you could bring back one ancient glassmaking secret, which one would you choose? The color-changing Lycurgus Cup, the intricate cameo of the Portland Vase, or the delicate cage cups of Rome? Each represents a peak of human ingenuity that took generations to build and a moment to lose. That is why we share these stories. The past is not just a museum of finished things. It is a reminder that knowledge is alive only when it is held by people who can pass it on. If you want to keep discovering forgotten stories of human ingenuity that reshape how we understand technology and culture, consider subscribing. Every video is a small act of recovery, bringing back something that was almost gone.